Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started here. And I wanted to let everybody know where we stand in the course right now. So I put up on the board here what we're going to do today. We started on chapter 8 on Monday, and sorry, this camera keeps over advancing here, and it has a real slow lag, real long delay. So every time I hit this, it kind of keeps on, keeps on going here. So if anybody's watching this video is wondering why it's all over the place here, that's the reason why. So we talked about chapter 8 beginning last time, and where we are in the class right now is we're talking about this this part of the class known as market structure theory. And so we've got 4 main market structures, and so I'm trying to get the camera right here, but it's extremely long lag time. So all right, so and we talked about the first of these on Monday. Today we're going to talk about the rest of perfect competition. There are a few things we should talk about with regard to that. It has to do really with sort of the unique configuration of marginal revenue in relation to demand, and particularly as it relates to the other 3 structures that we're going to be covering. So we're going to cover that. We're going to get into monopoly before we leave, but I don't think we're going to finish that. So I've indicated next week we come back. I think we'll finish we'll get into chapter 9, which is monopoly. And then, we'll see how it goes from there. And I think that we'll probably cover the rest of market structure into the following week. And so we're pretty much right on track with where we want to be. Does anybody have any questions on Monday, or anything in the text and as far as your readings go, or anything like that? Go ahead.
Do we get spring break?
There's no spring break. we used to have spring break, and spring break anymore. We had it, and then they took it away, and they came back for like a year, and then it's gone again. So no, there's no spring break. Sorry about that. So I know a lot of, in fact, my brother teaches at a school in DC, and he's on spring break now. So but no, unfortunately, that's not the case. So we are going to push forward then with the rest of chapter 8. I want to sort of bring you back here to just kind of cover where we are, and that's these 4 market structures: perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. And I'm going to give you something that, if you got this in your notes from Mondays, you don't need to write it down again, but I just want to sort of reiterate it because it's an important issue. And that is, when we talk about these 4 structures, perfect competition and monopoly, we're saying that these 2 are very much opposite one another. And as I mentioned in the class on Monday, when I talk about the characteristics, and I sort of went over those for the perfectly competitive structure on Monday, I said that with the exception of profit maximization, and almost every characteristic of perfect competition, you could sort of flip around on its head and it would define monopoly. That's how different they are. Having said that, then we get into this weird dichotomy, this weird paradox, I guess is a better word, where you get a hybrid of both of those. And I know that sounds inconsistent with the logic that I presented here. I presented these as North Pole, South Pole, positive charge, negative charge, however you want to think of these opposites. But then there's a blending of the 2 as a hybrid that we call monopolistic competition. But I'll talk about why that is. And it really has to do with time frame, where a firm can have sort of monopoly power in the short run and then revert in the long run to competitive. And then the final one is one that I think is probably the most interesting, and it's oligopoly. Now, the thing that we should know about these 3 collectively is that we sort of refer to these collectively as imperfect competition. And as I mentioned on Monday, we're not just simply, playing word games by saying, well, if it's not perfect competition, it must be imperfect competition. And the reason we're not just simply saying that these are what they're not, which is really essentially true, but nonetheless, it's not the complete explanation. The better explanation is that these 3 are indeed imperfectly competitive. There are some issues that prevent entry and exit of firms that come into the market and leave the market. It's difficult to get into some of these industries. And as a result, when we talk about the structure of the market or industry, again, it's a term we use interchangeably. These all share one collective aspect, in that they do not share the characteristics of perfect competition, particularly with regard to marginal revenue. That's really what I want to go where I want to go next. Is talking more about marginal revenue, and we sort of were running a little bit low on time on Monday. So let me sort of come back to this and talk a bit more about this idea of of marginal revenue and what it's about. And I think I'm kind of running through, and I probably didn't do it justice, frankly, just because of the fact that we were sort of pushing against the time limit. So one of the things about perfect competition that, again, makes it different than structures we're going to be talking about is the idea that we have this sort of split screen view. We have the market on the one hand, we have the PQ plane, which we've seen before, now it's nothing new. And then we have the firm itself. This is any individual firm, whatever it might be. And one of the characteristics we said about the firm, any firm in perfect competition, is that they've got low market shares, okay? And when we talk about market share, let's define what that really is, okay? Because I know it's a term we've all heard before. Usually it's expressed as a percentage. And you might have heard this before, percentage share of the market. And all we're really talking about here is we're talking about total revenue, right? As the total inflows to the firm in the normal course of doing business, the total revenue of the firm divided by the total revenue of the market or the industry. The market or the industry, that's all it is. And so as a result, you get up. So if you have, if $100 is the revenue for the firm and $10,000 is the total revenue for the industry, then we might have 0.01, or if you want to move the decimal 2 points to the right, 1% market share. And that would not be unusual. In fact, 1% for some industries might be a lot, as we'll talk about when we show you some examples of what these types of industries are. Lots and lots and lots of competitors, and no one firm can influence the market price of the good. Okay, so when we go back to this idea then of the market, we have upward sloping supply curve, nothing new there. Downward sloping demand curve, nothing new there. Then we have an equilibrium price determined by the market. Okay. So the equilibrium price is the equilibrium price. We say that the firms in perfect competition are price takers. Remember, that was one of the definitions of price takers. What does that mean? It means that what firms do, they can't influence the market price. They can't say, okay, I'm going to pack up and go home and I'll show you. It's not going to make any difference whatsoever. In fact, if one new firm shows up, it's not going to make any difference. If 10 new firms show up, it's usually not going to make any difference. Particularly when we talk about a national and then certainly international market. So the firm takes the price as given. We'll simply call that P star. That's just simply the price that they take. And so as a result, the demand curve looks like this. It makes no difference how much output the firm produces. They can produce here, 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 here. It doesn't make any difference. And so one of the things, and it's just simply a mathematical relationship, whenever you have on a two-dimensional graph like this, an expression that's either totally horizontal or totally vertical, it means it's independent of whatever it's parallel to. Just like when we had the vertical demand curve when it came to inelastic demand back in chapter 5. It was parallel to the price axis, meaning that it was independent of price. The quantity demand had nothing to do with price. Well, here, this is horizontal, and so we're saying that the firm has no influence on the price of the good. It can produce all the quantity. The price is independent of the quantity. The price is independent of the quantity. It doesn't make any difference how much the firm produces. It's going to take the price as given. And so furthermore, this is really the demand curve, right? And then as we walk through the exercise, this is one of the last things that we did on Monday, was we talked about the idea that the marginal revenue curve is essentially horizontal because of this particular nature. Okay. All right. We didn't really get into this issue of market share, but we did talk about it as one of the characteristics. Now, what we want to do is this. We want to talk about what this thing looks like in terms of its relationship to cost. Okay. So D equals M. Marginal revenue. Marginal revenue. Okay, change it. And again, marginal revenue is simply change in total revenue divided by the change in. I want to say change in quantity here. Okay, I want to say change in quantity. It's the same thing as total product. It's change in quantity. Okay. All right. I'll leave that up there, particularly for the benefit of the people in the room here, so you can kind of see what's going on. And I want to sort of swivel over here, because one thing that we haven't done yet, and I want to sort of I want to bring the issue of cost into play here, because it really now sort of describes very importantly how these firms react, particularly in the long run. Because one of the things that we said when I gave you a slide that talked about the characteristics of perfect competition, and one of those characteristics were that economic profit was possible in the short run, and it was possible only due to what we call economic luck. And I know that sounded like a bit of a, I don't know, sort of like I was pulling this out of my hat, like I just sort of made this up or whatever. And so as a result, it's not made up, it is what it is. And so again, we do the split screen view. We have the market here on the left. We have the firm itself on the right. And again, one of the conventions that we tend to use in particularly in micro is the fact that if you've got something larger than something else, like the market itself, we'll tend to put capital letters and we'll put small letters here, just as sort of a denoting what's going on. It's not necessary. I'm just explaining why I'm doing what I'm doing, just so that it helps to sort of understand what's happening. Okay, so there's the supply curve. Okay, there's the supply curve right there. And here's the demand curve. And you've got some equilibrium price. And we're going to put a little star by it since it's an equilibrium price. We're going to call that P1. Okay. And let me move this label up here a bit. All right, that's P1. So you've got what? You've got the firm will take the price as given. And so we'll say demand 1, marginal revenue 1. They're the same thing. They're identical things. We'll put the equilibrium price right there. Okay, well, let's say their average total cost looks something like this. Okay. Average total cost looks something like that. And let's say the output level for the firm is, let's say it's somewhere right here. Okay. Let's say that they're producing this amount of output. Well, then what do we have going on here? We've got the difference then between the cost and the average total cost and the price. So think about this. This is an important thing to think about. If the price of the good is greater than the average total cost, then we've got a positive economic profit. We're going to that all the implicit costs, the opportunity costs, have been baked into this cost formula. That is, this ATC curve has been baked in. Because remember, let's come back and circle back about what price is. Price is the output value, right, of the good per unit, right? And ATC is the input value per unit. And maybe I should put on here per unit just to sort of elaborate per unit. Okay, so basically, where do you want to be if you're a seller of goods? And you can't always be there, but you want to be in a place where you're charging more for the goods to your buyer than what it's costing you to produce. I think that might go without saying. I don't know. In other words, if the output value is greater than the input value, that's a good thing. And then the amount of profit is essentially this region here. This is all profit, because it's the difference. Remember, if profit is total revenue minus total cost, then what is total revenue? Total revenue is price times quantity minus, in this case, total cost. And so this is just simply on a per unit basis. Our shaded area here, okay? And that's essentially the amount of profit that's being earned. But we're saying that is a temporary condition. We're saying it's a short run situation. And we're saying it's due to economic luck. And I know that sounds like a bitter pill to swallow, particularly if you think as a seller, hey, I must be doing something right. I'm making money here with this. Now, I know too that we're talking about economic profit, not accounting profit. So it is possible. And remember, when we talked about economic profit, it's another layer of cost that represents the best opportunity available that the firm or any economic actor is foregoing. So that's not always obvious. And so sometimes firms look only at accounting profit, and that makes sense, right? They're the costs which, as we identified on Monday, they're verifiable, they're reliable, they're objectively arrived at, whereas implicit costs, not so much. But let's not worry about that. Let's just focus on the idea that the price is greater than the average total cost. And so we have a positive economic profit resulting from that, okay? So that is considered to be a good thing. Yeah, obviously, if you produce more output, then you might have a sort of a different situation going on here, okay? Now, one other thing that I'm going to elaborate on is this, okay? So, and this is something, if demand equals marginal revenue, right? If demand equals marginal revenue, and we went through the reasons why on Monday, I sort of went through a little matrix. I was sort of did it by the seat of my pants a little bit, but you get the idea. I think the price we said was $5 and the marginal revenue is $5. It's just simply all the way across for any unit of output. That's simply because of the fact that the firm is a price taker. It takes whatever price is given, okay? So if price is equal to marginal, price is equal to marginal revenue, so is demand. In fact, the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve for the firm. And we just really started getting into marginal revenue last time. It's incremental revenue. As I produce more output, I get more revenue. As I produce less output, I get less revenue. But what about marginal cost? We haven't really gotten into marginal cost here. And think about what the supply curve is for any firm. Remember what supply is. It's upward sloping, right? But it also means that as we produce more output, we incur greater cost. And so as a result, marginal cost looks something like this. It sort of is upward sloping. And so the supply curve is one and the same as the marginal cost curve. And that's something that you are going to want to remember, is the idea that supply and marginal cost are essentially the same thing. A supply curve is a marginal cost curve, just like a demand curve is a marginal revenue curve, but only for purposes of perfect competition. Okay, so we're going to sort of throw that out. I want to make clear that that marginal revenue will differ in the imperfectly competitive structure. And that's why I spent some time at the outset today going over marginal or going over those three those last three firms as being distinct from perfect competition. And it mostly has to do with marginal revenue, but not marginal cost. Marginal cost is what it is. And so here's the thing: the firm will always produce output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But we'll get to that in a second. For right now, let's talk about this idea of profit. Okay. And I'm going to have to swivel the camera again. And I apologize. I know it's a little bit clunky for those who are in the room here for me to be bouncing back and forth, but I think it's easier than starting a new board, going over there. Just given the fact that we've got that sort of limitation going on here. So let me swivel the camera. I need a cameraman, don't I? Maybe I should request a camera person. So, all right. So let me swivel back over here. Back to where we were. Okay. All right. So we're talking about profit. Okay. So let's say that we've got a condition where, and we said this is maybe an unusual situation. Okay. It's an unusual situation that a firm is making economic profit. Well, what about this? Let's say we've got this kind of thing going on here, and the firm is producing this level of output right here. Okay. And we've got some positive economic profit. Okay. Well, what is the natural inclination on the supply side? Remember, this left-hand side here is the market itself. And that, so remember, we said one of the characteristics of perfect competition is the idea that if the barriers to entry are low, then it means that the firms can come into the market, and also the barriers to exit are low, they can also leave the market. So think about this. Let's say that we've got this kind of situation, and we'll just simply label this P1 and we'll label this S1. So if there's a firm is making economic profit as where price is greater than average total cost for the output level that's being produced. Okay, we'll call that Q1, we'll call that P1. Well, what do you think is the motivating factor, or what is the motivating impetus then on the part of the supply side? The supply side is going to want to do what? It's going to want to provide more output. So as a result, the supply curve is going to shift right, meaning what? It's the entrance of new firms. Okay. Remember, we go back to chapter 3, we talked about what can cause supply to shift. In other words, we talked about supply determinants, and those supply determinants, among those were, the number of sellers. And so the number of sellers has now risen. So as a result, what do we got going on here now? Okay, well, now we've got a new equilibrium price, and it's market determined. So we'll put a little star by that. Now we've got an equilibrium price that goes right there. Now we've got a new equilibrium price. Uh-oh, look what happens now. At this output level, now we've got a gap. Now we've got a loss going on. So that's a problem, isn't it? There's a problem because of the fact that now we have new entrants of firms, and as a result, they've driven the price down. But we see this happening, don't we? In fact, we see this happening all the time, where if there are firms making money and barriers to entry are low in a particular structure, the firms can come in, they can leave, they can come in, they can leave. It's not that big of a deal because the costs are low, the products are not particularly differentiated. And we haven't really gotten into very much about this idea of differentiated, other than the fact that one of the characteristics that we talked about on Monday was the idea that products are mostly commoditized. And what is the thing that I said on Monday about this idea of commoditized products? And I said that sometimes I think we have the idea that, and sometimes people use the term commodity just as a sort of a fancy substitute for the word goods in general. But we're saying, we have a very specific definition. We're saying in economics that the word commodity is an undifferentiated good that is pretty much the same as any other good in the particular market that we're talking about. So green beans are green beans. potatoes are potatoes, and the site on Monday that, you know, if Idaho tries to position itself as it has for many decades as being some higher quality producer of potatoes, really the demand side's not that impressed. I mean, when's the last time you bought potatoes and you rejected ones that did not say Idaho and you chose the Idaho potatoes over the other potatoes? I mean, maybe you did that, maybe you're sold on that idea, but most people do not do that. And we know that because of the fact it's mostly a differentiated product, okay, an undifferentiated product. It's difficult. There are a lot of goods that are undifferentiated. There's just really no way to do anything about it. Because not to say there haven't been some success stories. And like the bottled water example is one that really stands out. And you might think, well, there's an example right there. Well, I bring it up because it's really one of the few that I can think of as being an example of a good that's really a commodity. I mean, you don't get much more commoditized than water. And yet you've got labels like Aquafina and Poland Springs and all that. For whatever reason, the demand side buys into that. Even though bottled water has not been shown to be all that different than regular water you get out of the water fountain. So, but nonetheless, people are sold on bottled water, and you know, and there's a brand to it. So, but that's one of the few examples I can think of, because the rest that have got brands are really something that is, there's a twist on the product that makes people loyal to it. So, anyway, in this particular case, there's positive economic profit being earned. It's the same graph that I gave you initially in the setup on the other side there, where I talked about the difference between price and average total cost. Again, price is here, cost of the unit is here, output value is higher than the input value. That's a good formula. That means profit all the way back to the origin and all the way representing price times quantity minus the cost. And so as a result, you get that sliver of profit. However, there's profit being made. Everyone sees there's profit being made. And sellers who are potential sellers in this market say, I want a piece of that. I want to get in there. I want to compete. And as they compete, they simply do what? They drive the price down to the point where now everyone is losing money. So if everyone's losing money, well, what does that mean? That's a signal to get out, isn't it? Why would you want to stay into a market where everybody's now losing money? That doesn't make any sense. And so now what we see happen is there's a reversal back in the other direction. Well, now firms want to leave the market. And so firms now decide that they want to get out of this particular market. Now we have a shift in the other direction. And we'll just simply, this is getting a little bit messy here, but when they want to shift back in this direction and they do that, so now we have yet another, we'll call this P3 here. Let me move this up to P1, P2. We'll call this P3. It's an equilibrium condition. Okay. And this is supply 3. We'll call that P. I guess I should have left myself some more room there when I did this, shouldn't I? And that's P3. So now what do we have? We have a condition where now we have demand 3, marginal revenue 3. Okay. And guess what has happened here? Now we have a point at which price is equal to average total cost. And what does that mean? If the output value per unit equals the input value per unit, then we've arrived at a point that we simply refer to as the break even. The break even point is 0 economic profit per unit or any economic. There is no profit because of the fact that the price equals the average total cost. And so as a result, there is no value in doing that. Stay in, the firm will stay into this market. And so when I say there's no value, there's no economic profit being earned, simply because of the fact that these curves are shifting to the right and to the left. So shifting to the left, why would firms leave the industry? They would leave the industry because of the fact there's now everyone's losing money. And this does happen where the market overshoots itself. It goes up, then it goes, and everyone's making money, then everyone rushes in to get a piece of the action. And then because people are now losing money, they rush out. And the example that I gave, which I think is a good example of an industry that is characterized by this kind of volatility, is oil drilling. I'm not talking about refining, which is basically the idea of processing crude oil to make things like, gasoline for one, but also things like, all the kind of byproducts like, motor oil and industrial lubricants and waxes and polishes and makeup and all these things that come out of oil. I'm talking about this drilling, this raw drilling of undifferentiated, fairly dirty product, which is why refining happens in the first place, is to clean that product up. This is why oil goes up, down, up, down, up, down. It's mostly a supply issue. It's not really demand at all. Yes, there are demand issues involved, particularly seasonally, as we hear all the time, as we head into summer. Demand for gasoline and all kinds of fuel for vehicles picks up. simply because more people are driving, vacation travel, more people are traveling around, particularly in the parts of the country in which road travel is somewhat challenging in different parts of the year. And also trucks. We haven't really talked much about that part of the aspect of it. I know they burn diesel primarily, but diesel is a derivative of motor oil or of raw crude oil as well. And so as a result, there are seasonal demand issues, but really the fluctuations in that are mostly supply. That is, there's a lot of profit being made. Everybody comes in to drive the price down before we're not stop profitable. Some will leave. And now who leaves? Not everyone leaves. Because even here, you've got some quantity being produced. And so who leaves? The producers that leave are the ones who are less efficient and don't have as much capital in order to sustain themselves. And so as a result, it's those who are stronger, better able to manage costs, maybe have more of a reserve of financial capital to withhold it. If they can hang, some people will leave, and it's just sort of the mercenary aspect of perfectly competitive industries that some will leave. Okay, so you might think, well, why on earth would anybody want to be in this industry? Well, there are reasons why somebody would want to be it. Number one, I think we see this with a lot of startup enterprises, whatever those enterprises happen to be. A lot of small businesses start out essentially in this particular industry structure, where they don't have a product that really stands out. They're trying to get a foothold in the market, and they're doing the same things that everyone else is doing. And unfortunately, that is not necessarily a recipe for success. And don't take my word for it. If you look at the failure rate of small businesses, it's traditionally been as high as 80% fail in the first 5 years. And that's been a pretty static percentage. It's not exactly around to 80%. In fact, if anything, 5 years may be too long. Some people have suggested maybe 3 years is about how long a firm can stand, mostly because they can't withstand that downswing or any kind of economic recession on the macro side. If there's a drop in demand because the macro environment is not good, like a recession is underway, then can a firm sustain itself, particularly a new business that doesn't have many customers, isn't producing a product that is very differentiated? And this is one reason why a lot of small businesses simply don't really make it. And that's an unfortunate situation, but it does happen. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. And you know, don't take my word for it. Again, the failure rate of some small businesses is very high, and it's oftentimes due to these sorts of dynamics. So again, to answer the question, why would anybody want to do this? Well, maybe they're earning an accounting profit and just enough accounting profit to get by. Just enough accounting profit to get by. So as a result, they're paying their bills, they're paying the workers, paying the suppliers, paying their long-term lease payments, making a mortgage payment, and that's about it. Maybe some profit to the owners. And then in some good years, you might have this condition over here that I talked about, where you have this price being greater than average total cost, and that may continue for a while. It may take new sellers a while to get into the market. It's not always the case. It's not just a case where suddenly the price goes up to a point where it's now profitable and everybody jumps in it. There may be a transition, it may take a couple of years. So you may have some good times. Also, there is one particular industry that, and I'll get to the examples here in a second of what these industry structures are. But agriculture is almost tailor-made for this particular example of perfect competition. Almost anything that has to do with producing crops in particular is almost all perfect competition. And I think I sort of alluded to this with my discussion of vegetables, saying that green beans are green beans, potatoes are potatoes. Well, the same goes with pretty much any of these commodity sorts of outputs. So you might wonder, well, why does anybody want to be a farmer or whatnot? And that's a good question. And one reason why is because the fact that, number one, they're sort of stuck in that position where if you're in farming, it's not like you're going to turn all that into something different. And I know I come from a farm family, and my grandfather, as far back as the mid-1960s, decided he wanted to do something else and began to sell off bits and pieces. He had a lot of farm, he had like 20,000 acres. He sold a bunch of it off to developers to build houses on. So, and then some he leased to coal companies to do strip mining. So he was not exactly an environmentalist. He's not going to win any awards for clean energy for that. But you know, because of the fact that the ups and downs of the price was just too brutal, and so he decided he would diversify and get out of that. Today, my cousin and uncle still farm, and but for the most part, my family still primarily just lease it to other farmers who do want to do it. They've got lots and lots and lots of machinery and equipment, and they can do it. And right now, farming is becoming a bigger business than the small operator really finds it difficult to compete in an industry that really requires scale, and that's what we're seeing. Remember, we talked about scale prior to our second exam. What is economies of scale? It's this idea of moving down along a long run curve by producing more and more output. One reason why is you can absorb some of those fixed costs. Remember, the average fixed cost curve does this, and it drives, average fixed cost is simply fixed cost over total output. If you're driving the denominator up while the fixed cost stays fixed in the short run, you're driving that curve down. So it's all about volume and getting to that point of producing more volume. Small businesses can't get to that point. They can't get to scale necessarily. Okay, so that's an important thing to think about. Other questions about that? Because I know that's kind of it's kind of a busy slide, set of slides there. And I know that it might be easier if we had like transparencies, but I don't know what happened to our transparency. We used to have an overhead projector and I had some transparencies, but I don't know where that got to. So hopefully that is reasonably explanatory as to what is going on. Okay. All right. Two more things before we get into this. I want to focus on something I just talked about over here, and that's the idea of price and average total cost. And I want everybody to make sure that you have this in your notes and you are referring to it because it's really a very important thing. And that is this, and it relates particularly to this idea of perfect competition. And that is when, and I'll give you this again, just you've already got it. If price is greater than average cost, we have a positive economic profit. Okay, positive economic profit. All right, if price is equal to average total cost, then we have zero economic profit, right? Zero economic profit. And essentially we have reached the break-even point. So those are, I just want you to have all this together in one sort of place here. So you've got the first two I've given you, but I want to put them together because I'm not quite done here yet, okay? So, and if price is less than average total cost, we have a negative economic profit. There's one final thing here that we should, and that's pretty self-explanatory. If price is greater than average total cost, in other words, if the output value is greater than the input value, then it's positive profit per unit. Makes sense. And if it's less than that, then it makes sense you've got a negative economic profit, also known as a loss. Also known as a loss, right? But there's one other thing that we should talk about, and that is this. What if, how long does a firm stay in? Okay, how long does a firm stay into the game, theoretically at least, when the price has fallen below the cost per unit? In other words, it's costing you more to produce the output than you are getting from the output, but maybe you don't want to leave the game. Why would you want to leave? And this is something that I know that econ textbooks in my mind probably don't do enough justice to this idea of what is the staying power, how long do you want to stay in, and why would you want to stay in? And that is you're losing money per unit, but maybe you can hold out for a little bit, right? And I talked about this idea of the bigger firms, maybe the better capitalized firms. You might want to stay in because number one, it's difficult to get out. I'm not saying the exit barriers are high. I'm saying it's difficult from a practical standpoint. Because what do you have to do? You have to lay workers off, right? Nobody really wants to do that. I know it sounds, and I know that, if you read econ textbooks or whatnot, it sounds like just a simple business decision. Okay, let's lay off 10 workers, right? Makes it sound like it's no big deal. Well, it's not really a big deal. And most firms that I am familiar with, having worked in banking for a lot of years, really agonize over laying workers off. It's not something that's easy to do. And frankly, having been in management for a lot of years, I don't like to fire people. It's probably one of the least favorite things in the world. Getting my blood drawn is one thing I hate. Every time I have to go get, my doctor says, oh, we need to test your cholesterol. It's like, I hate that. And I hated firing people, right? I don't like going to the dentist. I'll go to the dentist every day of the year if I can avoid getting my blood drawn. But that's just me. I'm kind of a sissy in that kind of a wimp in that regard. But this is not pleasant. So a lot of managers don't like to do it. In fact, if you've got a manager that, I know when I was in graduate school, when I did my master's, I had a professor who said, if you know a manager who likes to fire people, you ought to make sure you don't never turn their back on that person. Maybe they're a psychopath, right? So, and I'm not exaggerating at all. I mean, I think it's not something people like to do. So that's not good. Also, terminating leases. Okay, you're telling your landlord, I got to move out. I'm breaking the lease. That's not good. They might pursue you for a while. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you think you can come back later and reestablish business. You've got to cut off contracts with suppliers. You've got to settle receivables. You've got taxes you've got to pay. You've got to generate at least some cash, you would think, in order to pay some bills. And so what you're theoretically going to do is you're going to work your way down to average variable cost. And anything below average variable cost is something that you are not, at that point, it doesn't make any sense to stay in. To say that when price equals average variable cost, you've reached the shutdown point. Or if this is BEP, this is what we call SDP. Not the motor oil, but rather the shutdown point where you're going to produce where price equals average variable cost, because there it makes zero sense because you can't even pay your workers. And so yes, you don't want to lay workers off, but you can't pay them either. So would you rather have them work for free? No, that's not good either. You can't pay the material suppliers. Remember what the variable costs are. Variable costs are those costs which vary with the level of production. Okay. They vary with the level of production. So as a result, if you can't make those costs, can't make payroll, can't pay inventory, can't pay invoices for things that you've got coming in, then there's no point whatsoever. And as a result, you should shut down. But you might stay in the game for a little bit, assuming that you can finance the losses, because you do have losses. Plus, there's one other thing we should talk about is this, that economic profit, and we got into this in the last segment of the class. We said economic profit could be positive. In a perfect competition, we're saying that's only a temporary condition. We're saying it's due to economic luck, where simply there's maybe the demand for the good is rising through the roof, and so as a result, the price is high. Maybe there are very few suppliers. Maybe some suppliers have gone out. Who knows, for whatever reason. So you're being lucky in the short run. You've got economic luck on your side. So you may have positive profit. You may have zero economic profit. And you may have negative economic profit, but still continue to operate because of the fact that maybe your accounting profit is zero, is positive, or at minimum zero. Okay. Your accounting profit may be zero because remember the economic profit is always less than accounting profit. So given that fact, if economic profit is always less than accounting profit, then it might be the fact that you've got some accounting profit in order to make payments and stay in the game for as long as possible. Okay. The other thing too, and I'll talk about some examples of this in a second, but things like there are some industries like agriculture that do receive subsidies. So on occasion, particularly when there's a really bad situation where farmers are losing money, historically there have been government subsidies, and certainly there are a lot, and that's by no means the only productive activity in the economy that's received subsidies. The oil industry has received subsidies. Lots and lots of areas in the economy receive government subsidies. But all a subsidy is simply a government payment. It's simply a government payment to support whatever it is you're doing. Kind of like you could refer to as the analogy of the stimulus checks a lot of us got during the pandemic. Well, this is not to a household, but it's to a firm or to a collection of firms in the industry. And that's simply, there's a lot of politics involved with that. Elected officials oftentimes are responsible for enacting those. And one of the things that we should be aware, and I think I mentioned this earlier in the course, is the idea that in the US and a lot of other countries, agricultural interests have an outsized amount of political influence simply because of the fact that the way our system works electorally is that a state like Wyoming, a very small state, and mostly agricultural, has the same number of votes in the US Senate as does a manufacturing state like New York or New Jersey or California. And so as a result, and you add up all these agricultural states together that do very little but agriculture, they end up being very powerful political interests. That's why ag is one of those that is a little bit of an exception, but there's no question that it sort of fits the bill because it's got every other characteristic. Price variability, we see price variability all the time. And those of you who have been looking at the sort of the prices throughout the economy, which is more of a macro thing. We don't really talk about inflation very much in micro, but we've seen lots of inflation, and particularly we've seen lots of variability in food prices, and certainly eggs. I mean, everyone's been talking about the price of eggs. I don't even know what eggs go for. I haven't bought eggs in a while, but somebody was saying, I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that they saw $4 per dozen. Does that sound about right to anybody who's bought eggs? I don't $6, is that what it is? That's even higher number than what I heard. So yeah, there's variability. I don't suspect that $6 is going to be there forever. I think it'll probably fall at some point. We will see. We'll see what happens. Okay. All right. So questions about this. This is an important thing to know about. Make sure that you've got those written down. This idea of price in relation to cost, in particular, this idea of shutdown point. And this is where a firm will work its way all the way down to below average variable cost, which is, by the way, where does average variable cost lie? It comes in somewhere here. It's somewhere below average total cost, and so the firm will be somewhere right down there where the price will be here. And by the way, if the price falls, right, remember with the supply curve, they'll simply slide down their supply curve, their marginal cost curve, and they'll produce less output, and they'll accept a lower price. But once it gets to average variable cost, there's none of this makes any sense at all. It goes all the way to zero. Okay, in this particular idea. Okay. All right. One other thing, and then I'll wrap up chapter 8 and move into chapter 9 here, and that has to do with what is the optimal output decision and how can any firm in any industry operate, given the fact, particularly in perfect competition, which I think, if I haven't already sort of made the case here, I'm saying that life is sort of difficult for firms in perfectly competitive industries. That is, if these are firms with no differentiation of product, and as a result, they're simply going with the flow. They're simply producing at whatever the price is that the market brings them. Well, how is a firm supposed to guide itself? How is a firm supposed to guide itself? So, again, let's take a look at the firm itself here. And I'm going to erase this so there's no confusion. This will be not related to that. And that is, how does a firm make its way into the world here where you've got a demand curve looking something like this, right? Demand, and we'll say it's demand equals marginal revenue, it's one and the same. And then you've got a marginal cost curve or supply equals marginal cost looking something like that. Now, this particular model, particularly given the idea that marginal revenue is horizontal here, is only applicable to the model of perfect competition, which again, as I know I keep saying this, it's why I really am on the soapbox about differentiating these last three structures from the first structure, because they're different, particularly related to marginal revenue. Not so much marginal cost, but marginal revenue. Okay, well, let's take a look here and think about what is going on. And we'll look at it. I'll be sort of from the analogy of like a lottery or a slot machine. A slot machine. That is this. Okay, think about this. If you are, let's say you're putting a quarter in the slot machine and you're getting $1 back every time, right? Then what are you motivated to do as this is happening, right? And I realize that, yes, it's probably not the best analogy because, slot machines don't typically pay out on a regular basis. That's part of the whole trick behind slot machines. But whatever you're doing, if you're getting a bigger payout for whatever it costs you to produce that per unit, then what should you do? You should do more of that, right? Theoretically, if you're interested in maximized behavior, remember when it comes to business firms, we said that all economic actors engage in maximizing behavior. We're saying that a business firm's goal is to maximize profit, and you're earning more per unit than what it's cost you per unit, then you should do more of that. Whatever it is, if you're getting more benefit than the cost, you should do more of that until the point at least where they're equal. On the other hand, what if you're out here and you're producing where every unit of value that you get, revenue, is less than what you're getting, and so as a result, you should do less of that, right? You should do less of that activity. So as a result of this, because if it's costing you more to do than what you're getting, you should do less. Instead, you should at minimum get to this point here, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we're saying, is the profit maximizing quantity. And so we're going to make the case here that every firm in every industry, right? I'm going to write this on board. All right, because you're going to see it as we get going throughout the next three structures, but we're going to see that every firm, and again, we want to come back to this idea of firm as we defined it back, I don't know, week 1 or week 2, when we talked about economic actors. We're saying for profit, privately owned, every firm in every industry, right? An industry structure, that is every industry type, right? Will produce output. And output, we'll simply refer to as Q here, okay, going forward, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so we can go ahead and say, okay, the profit maximizing quantity is at the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And I'll sort of enshrine that. It's almost a law, right? Almost like the law of demand. Law of supply is probably more likely here. Every firm in every industry structure will produce output Q where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Because what is going on here, if it makes sense to produce, so if you're making more per unit than what it's costing you, and you want to do more of it, then you want to at least the very last unit that you produce theoretically should be where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which means there's zero marginal profit at that last unit, but you won't know until you get to that point. Maybe you overshoot the mark a bit, and every loss here takes away from some of the profit that you earned up to that point cumulatively, but for the most part, that is the theoretical idea, is that marginal revenue is marginal cost. That's the cornerstone idea for economics. And it comes up again and again and again, and it's something you should know about. And by the way, too, one of the things that I think it's important to mention, as I mentioned on a couple of occasions, is that I mean, the accounting world has got some different definitions of cost and profit, and you might not see these marginals. They might not come up as often in accounting or finance. And I say that only because, you know, it's mostly an econ concept, but it's got relevance. It's got real relevance to what we're talking about here. Okay. All right. So are there questions for anything that I've talked about here with regard to some of the graphing? I know it's a little bit intense, and we're going to do a lot of different categories here. And so I want to just sort of finish up here by talking about, and I don't know what this looks like on the video, so I'm going to sort of dim the lights here a bit so we can all see. So again, some of these I've alluded to, but these are some examples, and some of these you've got in your text, and some of these I know you've got the slide package. So agricultural output is number one on the list here of examples of firms in perfect competition. I can't think of any that's more akin to this. It almost sort of cries out to as a definition of ag or a perfect competition. Timber, fishing. Keep in mind, these are all goods that don't have commoditized, or that do have commoditized products. In other words, these products are what we call undifferentiated. That is, timber is basically timber. Fish are fish. You know, I mean, obviously, salmon is different than trout, but you know, do you really care where your salmon was caught? I mean, I know that sometimes you get the idea that sellers would like you to believe that there's something qualitatively better about Alaska trout versus Colorado trout. I don't know that the demand side really cares. They are what they are. Mineral production, coal is coal, copper is copper. And then one area that we haven't really gotten into much is low value output. I sort of elaborated a little bit on this before when we talked about this idea of small businesses. A lot of small businesses will produce a lot of low value output, mostly consumer goods. And we're talking about here areas in which you're not doing anything that's too different than others. And so as a result, you get into this idea of low value output, particularly low value retail output. And we're talking about bars and restaurants, personal services like pet grooming, dog walking, house cleaning, you know, all these that are, you know, there's not much differentiation. Yes, you could be a better house cleaner, I suppose, or babysitter, daycare provider, you know, better bartender or whatnot. But it really comes down to the idea, and we're talking it's a relative term, basically. One issue is it's relative to some other sorts of output in the economy, and it's low cost and also low value per unit. So you've got to create lots and lots of volume. That's the problem, is the idea of trying to get the volume. Okay. So those are some examples of perfect competition. I'm sure there are others as well that sort of come up. And I think that when I talk about small businesses, I do want to make one sort of modification to this, because there are startups that do have very high value output and are in fact maybe on their way toward becoming quite big. I mean, some of the biggest firms in America, Apple and Hewlett Packard, I mean, all started out in like garages and whatnot. So it is possible to have some good that is able to take off, right? But it's got to have some sort of value to the demand side, and where people are willing to pay up. And one way you can get over that is to have some sort of support to get you through the point at which you can get up to scale. And that's an important thing. There are certain, I mean, like Amazon, you know, started up, you know, in Jeff Bezos's dad's garage back in what, 94, something like that. Nobody had ever heard of Amazon.com. It was only books at that time. Amazon lost money year after year after year. And it was only until like several years in before they started making money just on books. And then they got into other things, which obviously you could buy pretty much anything on Amazon. But it took a while, and they had lots of capital to be able to sustain themselves. There are firms that have been around that have never even made a product, not a profit, a product for years, but they can stay in there simply financial wherewithal to do it. I'm thinking of Genentech. It's a biotech company. Now it's going great guns, but for years and years they didn't even have a product to sell. They were paying rent. They were doing all these things. So it is difficult. So there are startup firms that can make it because of the fact that they've got a product, but they've got to have the support to do it. They can't survive. Typically, what is the down cycle of that small businesses run into? It's just a difficult thing. And there are some small businesses, particularly there are bars and restaurants that do survive over the long haul. There's lots of turnover in these restaurants and bars, and probably more restaurants than bars, because bars, have well, by definition, they have alcohol. So that's a high margin particular good. Lots of turnover in restaurants. And I know we talked a bit before class about the restaurant business being very difficult, particularly hard hit during the pandemic, and no question about that difficult. Okay, all right. So questions for me about anything with regard to perfect competition? All right. Well, that's the first industry that we're going to cover. So now we're going to sort of switch gears. We're going to talk about Chapter 9, dealing with monopoly. Okay. All right. Now, what did I say at the outset, and what did I also say on Monday? It's like you can take pretty much every characteristic of perfect competition, with the exception of profit maximizing quantity, and say that it is the polar opposite of perfect competition. By the way, if we scroll back, let me just go back up here just for a second. Perfect competition, what do we say? That profit maximizing output is the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That is a formula that carries over all industries, and I didn't touch on that very much on Monday. I really wanted to get into more of the marginal cost issue as it relates to marginal revenue, but that's really about the only characteristic I could think of that's going to be common. So what is a monopoly? We've all played the monopoly game, and we're snowed in and we've got all day to play. And so what is the objective in the game Monopoly? What is the objective in that game? What are you trying to do when you play the game Monopoly? And relative to your fellow player, you're trying to do what? Make them go away, right? You're trying to wipe them out so that you're the only player left. Well, that's essentially sort of a explanation of what monopolies really are. Monopolies are simply a single firm supplying all, and we'll put all qualifying or nearly all of the output in a market. Okay, all or nearly all of the output in the market. Now I say nearly all because there are some examples of monopolies that, and I'll give you two historical examples that never had 100% of the market share. Remember, market share, as I gave you that formula earlier, was simply the revenue earned by one firm in relation to revenue earned by the market. And so I'll give you two historical examples of firms that were definitely considered monopolies under every definition that we have of monopolies, but they didn't ever get to 100%. Okay, but they got so big that in essence they essentially were monopolies in every other characteristic. Okay, so it's a single firm. Okay, so what about this idea of a single firm and how do you get there? Well, let's talk about some of the characteristics of monopolies. Then we'll get into some of these issues concerning marginal revenue. I don't think we're going to get all the way through this today. Let's talk about some of the characteristics. Number one, it sort of goes back to the definition of single producer or seller. It's extremely high firm market share. So we're talking about around 90%, something like that. And that might sound like, well, it's not 100%, so it's not a monopoly. And by the way, I know that the last big monopoly trial that we had was when the government took Microsoft to court. Now, we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. We talk about the legal issues concerning monopolies, but we've had a body of law in the books for 130 years called antitrust law. And it's basically to prevent monopolies. The very first law was passed in 1890. It's called the Sherman Antitrust Act, maybe something you've heard of before. And the idea was basically to break out monopolies, because at the time, in the early stage of industrialization, there were lots and lots of monopolies in this country. It wasn't just the Standard Oil monopoly, which is the one that is probably the most famous. We also have monopolies in steel. We had a wool monopoly, we had a leather monopoly, there was a sugar monopoly. It just went on and on and on. In certain local areas, in certain regional areas, there were rail monopolies, where maybe the New York Central was the only railroad serving part of a particular state. So as a result, they had a monopoly. Maybe not a national monopoly, it's certainly not international, but for the most part, that is essentially a monopoly when there is no other firm providing that. And we'll talk, there's a chapter, we'll get to more on antitrust enforcement and what it's about. And more importantly, how we measure the degree of market power. Again, market power being the ability to control price. A bit later, but for right now, we'll just simply talk about this. By the way, the term antitrust, where does that come from? And why are we talking about the word trust? Well, simply put, just so that you're wondering, okay, what does antitrust mean? Where does that term come from? Well, what happened during the early industrial period in this country, which is sometime around the mid-1800s to, well, really till today for the most part, that you had these big firms, and it was illegal at the time for corporations to do business across state lines, which today seems kind of crazy and antiquated and antique. But it was illegal. So what these big firms would do is simply have partners. They would own pieces of the company, and they would set up their own little companies that would be, and they would have it in the form of a legal form of a trust. A trust is just a legal agreement, usually a confidential legal agreement. And then that way they were able to sort of branch across state lines because the firm itself was not doing it. It was some affiliate that was set up as a trust. And so breaking those up was the original intent of antitrust law. Today, antitrust law goes to many more lengths, such as the government trying to do things against Google. I've talked about this a couple of times in class, and we're going to see what happens with that. I know it was about a month ago when the Attorney General himself came out and said that, hey, Google does this, they control all these things, and so as a result, we're going to go after Google. And so we'll see what happens. Okay, we'll see how that goes. But that's the biggest one since Microsoft in the late 90s, and I'll come back to Microsoft and talk a bit more about that later. Okay, there are few or no substitutes for the good exist. So sometimes you can be a monopoly because there just simply is no substitute. Whatever you're doing, there is no other competing thing going on here. Now, by the way, I come back to this idea. Remember on Monday we talked about barriers to entry. In barriers to entry, we said that one of the barriers to entry are legal barriers, like these legal protections like copyrights, patents, trademarks, and all these. These are kind of things that are owned by one seller, by one supplier, and they can't be replicated. And the example I gave of patents were the drug industry, okay, where prescription drugs are developed, and for a period of years, no other producer can provide that market or provide that good in the particular market. But the day that thing goes off of patent, when it expires, you've got all these competitors who, today you can see to pretty much figure out what's in a drug. And by the way, this all becomes published, and you've got people looking at drug companies who are much smarter at chemistry than what I am, certainly, and which is not hard to get over, but they can figure out what's in the good. And so the millisecond this thing loses its patent protection, you've got all kinds of substitutes for the good. But while that's going on, there are few or no substitutes for the good because of the fact that good isn't a patent. So you've got really what is technically a monopoly for a brief period of time and I forget what it is. I think I said it was like 10 years for drugs, prescription drugs. I think it used to be 7. I think they extended it just as a way to incentivize the creation of new drugs. And so I could be wrong about that. If I am, it's not an important point. It's not really going to be an exam, but you get the idea that very few or no substitutes exist. We go back to barriers to entry. Extremely high, almost insurmountable barriers to entry exist. That is, it really is hard to get into competing against these particular kinds of firms. Now, we're going to talk about natural monopolies a bit later, probably later that today. We'll probably get to that next week, but there is a form of monopoly that is mostly local, and we call those natural monopolies. And this is where it becomes really difficult to get into this market. And so if it becomes difficult to get in, you really can't get out. So if you can't get out, why get in? Remember that one of the entry barriers was an exit barrier. So exit barriers themselves are entry barriers. If you can't get out of what you're doing, why get in? But in terms of insurmountable entry barriers, and one of the examples that we're going to talk about of a local phenomenon are things like utilities, like electricity, natural gas, water, where in most areas of the country, you've only got really one provider. And think about the difficulties of trying to compete against a P&M, for instance. What would you have to do if you wanted to set up a competing electric utility? Not that you would, but if you did want to, you'd have to get, first of all, you'd have zero market share. You'd have to have all this infrastructure, power lines stretched across the country, across the city, and however, I think P&M served most of the state, right? So they've just a tremendous investment with zero revenue coming in. And who would want to back that, right? It's one thing to back an Apple or an Amazon when they're in the early stages, if you get a good idea, but nobody would think that's a good idea, competing against P&M, which has already got the market locked down. And so why go after it? Why produce it? Or a water company? You'd have to get your own, source of water and water filtration, all the systems that go into it, and the pipes. And by the way, how many pipes and wires do we want to run into every house and business in a city just in order to accommodate competition? So we do accommodate these as what we call natural monopolies. And I'll talk a bit more about the economics of that, what that looks like a bit, probably next week. But there are, for the most part, that would be an example of a barrier to entry that you really can't get into. And nobody would want to get into it, and the economics of it don't make sense. And so they're not rewarded. And we'll talk a bit more about what we do about P&M, because if it's a monopoly, and it is, what do we do about it? How do we prevent P&M from doubling our electric bill, tripling our electric bill, quadrupling it? What's to stop it? And the stoppage of that is regulation. Okay. More on that a bit later. Okay. All right. So it's insurmountable to the point where it becomes difficult. And by the way, I say almost insurmountable because yes, there are some monopolies that firms do eventually get into. Now we're going to say that it's unusual in the global context for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's lots of regulation worldwide to try to prevent monopolies from getting started in the first place. But also to get over these entry barriers, if there's profitability that's possible, then some sellers will want to come in, particularly if they have the financial wherewithal to do it. And they've got the backing of investment firms and wealthy investors and whatnot to get over the hump. That they can, but it's difficult. But I will say there's a lot of money flowing around, sloshing around in the world today that what once seemed like impenetrable barriers to entry, in some cases not so much. And the example I gave on Monday was about local long distance, or not local, it was long distance service, where AT&T had a monopoly in this country for many, many decades. And MCI was one startup that said, hey, we can break into that. It was a series of legal challenges that allowed them to get going. But it is possible, it's practically insurmountable. Okay, one other thing here, market demand is the demand curve for the firm. Now, this might sound obvious, but here there is no split screen between the industry and the firm itself. Okay, because why? Because the firm is essentially the industry, and whatever other competitors out there are not worth really noting, and as a result, they really don't make much difference. Like I guess you could say, even with something like a P&M, what we call a natural monopoly, I guess you probably do have competition from, sellers of, I don't know, wood pellets and whatnot, so people can use that to heat their homes and whatnot, power their, whatever, I mean, generators and whatnot. I guess there's probably that, but it's not big enough, not important enough. So for the most part, the market demand curve is the demand curve for the firm. There is no split screen. Okay. The firm controls the output, hence the market price, therefore is a price maker. So if perfectly competitive firms are price takers, the water monopoly firms, they're price makers. That's just the opposite. Again, we sort of flip these things around on their head and say that if one thing is this thing, the other thing is the other. So firms essentially dictate the market price. This is, by the way, one of the major problems with monopolies, and I'm going to get into this a bit later and talk about why are we so vigilant, really, from a legal standpoint, of trying to prevent monopolies and trying to break them up. And it really has to do with this idea of price. But it isn't just price, but price is really the sort of the driver for everything because there's no competition, so they can set the price wherever they want. Okay, and when it comes to natural monopolies like P&M, we'll talk about how we regulate that. The marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve due to what's called the negative price effect. Okay, and let's talk about that. I think that's probably going to be the last thing that I'm going to talk about today, and it'll be a good place to stop and a good place to leave and pick up on Tuesday of next week. Okay, so let's talk about what this is about here. Okay, so and this is, by the way, going to be a very similar sort of graph that you'll see throughout the rest of the imperfectly competitive structures. So this is what marginal revenue looks like in the context of perfect competition. I'm just going to leave it up there. That's the firm in perfect competition. I'm just going to leave it up there. And then we'll talk about the firm in monopoly, okay? Firm in monopoly, because these two are very different. So this is now the monopoly firm. And this is the perfectly competitive firm, okay? So here we've got a price and quantity, and we've got a downward sloping demand curve, which is something like that. The market demand curve is the same as the demand curve facing the firm. So nothing new there. This is all stuff that we've seen before. Then we've got a supply curve. Supply, which is the same as marginal cost. Again, there's no difference there with marginal cost when it comes to different structures. But here's one thing that's a little bit different, and it has to do with marginal revenue. The marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. It looks something like that. It lies to the left and it's steeper, and we'll talk about, I can give you some examples. Excuse me, when I have more time on Tuesday. So why is this steeper? What's going on here? And in other words, what is this negative price effect? Okay. Well, remember what marginal revenue is. Marginal revenue is simply this. It's the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. Okay. Well, let's take total revenue. And what is total revenue? Total revenue, price times quantity, right? Simply the price of a good times the quantity of a good. In other words, it's the inflow to the firm. Well, all right, think about this. We've talked about this idea of the law of demand before, right? And there's a reason why we went into all these preliminaries as to law of demand, the law of supply and all that. And one of the things we said with the law of demand is this. If the price of the good goes up, then the quantity demanded goes down, right? And likewise, if the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. And we'll put a little D there, that's fine. That's the law of demand. In other words, what have we got going on here? We've got two vectors working against each other. We've got a push-pull, right? Think of two arm wrestlers. We got two forces, one pushing upward, one pushing downward, right? So what carries the day? What wins? In other words, does the price effect overwhelm the output effect? Because price is one vector, and that is, as we produce more output, the price of the good comes down. Because the good is less scarce, because people get less marginal utility from the good. If we want to produce more output, the price has to come down, okay? Even while the quantity is going up. So you've got two factors going on. And so what's happening here is that which of these arm wrestlers wins the game? Two vectors, just two forces pushing against each other. Which force wins? And we're going to say the price factor wins. And we're going to say that what's called the price effect overwhelms the output effect. Okay, the price effect. I hope everybody can see this. I know sometimes people are putting in the text box, they can't see down low. So I'll make sure that you get this, the camera is able to see this. The price effect overwhelms the output effect, which is why we get this steep slope to marginal revenue. The price effect is the winner of the game. The more output you produce, the lower the price has to go. Oh, I think you can see it. The more output you produce, the lower the price has to go because the good becomes less scarce. So as the good becomes less scarce, the price goes down. So we're producing more and more output. And so as a result of that, the price is lowering, which is simply the law of demand. That's all we're doing here is simply restating the law of demand. But what we have not gotten into is which of these is carrying the day? Which of these is a contributor to total revenue? Is price carrying the day or is quantity carrying the day? And we're saying price is. As the price goes down, then we have a much steeper slope of marginal revenue. So this means what then? It means that if you're a seller of a good, maybe you don't want to produce that much output because in so doing, all you do is lower marginal revenue much faster because it diminishes much faster than the demand in general. Okay. So that is something that's really important. And it's going to tie back in this idea of profit maximization as we get more into that. Okay. All right. So I think that's a pretty good stopping point for today. And so this is a good jumping off point for we come back on Monday because we'll talk a bit more about profit maximization, what the long run looks like. Here we're saying that profit could be possible in the long run for these firms because, hey, they're monopolies. So they've got, this is probably the pinnacle of where you'd want to be if you're a seller of products, whereas this perfect competition, maybe not so much. Okay, so questions for me about anything that we've talked about here today? Anybody on the Zoom call got any questions? Let me make sure that nobody's putting anything in the chat area here, and our viewers are mostly silent. We're free to talk. Okay, well, we will see you all next week. So have a great weekend. See you next time.